There's a persistent myth that still lives today that, Hitler ordered the invention of the magnetophone tape recorder to fool the Allies as to his whereabouts. Well, that's nonsense. When high-fidelity tape recording came along, yes, they recorded Hitler. Yes, his speeches were tape-delayed and sent around. So, of course, anybody in the Allied command listening to or monitoring German broadcasting would hear him pop up, well, gee, this is coming out of the Munich transmitter, and all of a sudden we're getting a speech, and he's making local references to Hamburg, and now he's in Berlin. How are they doing this? Well, the same way they always did, clear back to the 1920s, with an advanced, high-quality, live network with some sort of time delay device, in this case, tape.
As the war drew to a close, the plunder of Nazi technology and scientific secrets by the victorious Allies began in earnest. A US Army Signal Corps Major, Jack Mullin, and his team were given the task of collecting the most recent German electronics technology. Mullin had been intrigued by the high quality of late-night wartime German broadcasts.
I thought I was pretty familiar with what all types of recording were, film and disc, and this sounded superb, and we thought probably Hitler must be having people work all night.
Then, on a visit to a radio station a few weeks after the German surrender, Mullin heard an AC bias hi-fi magnetophone.
I'd never heard anything like that in my life before. I couldn't hear any background noise, very clean, no distortion that I was able to hear.
Mullin copied the blueprints, shipped 2 surplus machines to America, and in May 1946, he revealed his Americanized tape recorders. It changed the entire course of the broadcast and music industries worldwide.
It was a sensation. May 16, 1946 is a breakthrough date in American tape recording technology.
Where the blue of the night.
Bing Crosby was the first Hollywood star to use this new technology from Nazi Germany. The singer found live radio a chore, and when he heard about the amazing new machines, he hired Mullin to record and edit his show for broadcasting later. It was a first.
The little piece of tape that I'm going to play on here was actually recorded in 1947, and it still sounds as good as it ever did.
Where the blue of the night meets the gold of the day.
The first show, Bing's rating shot back up. The switchboard at ABC-NBC was flooded with calls from LA residents. Why didn't you tell us Bing was going to be live? We wanted tickets.
During the war, for the Nazis, the magnetophone was simply an existing technology they could exploit to suit the needs of the moment. This was true of much of their scientific work. Indeed, some historians dismissed the traditional view of grim-faced teams of researchers ruthlessly pursuing a Nazi scientific utopia. It was often much more haphazard.
And if you think of the popular image of the Nazi, you have the immaculately tailored officer and the professor in his crisp laboratory coat, and they're dealing with the highest level of technology, and they have some maniacal plan. Now, the maniacal plan idea is absolutely correct, but the rest of it is totally false.
In fact, one of the most important scientific inventions of the entire 20th century was developed by German scientists, and the Nazi hierarchy almost ignored it. This is the common view of science and technology under the Nazis. The mentally ill and the victims of the concentration camps were heartlessly used as guinea pigs in medical experiments. These lives in Nazi ideology were hardly human and certainly not worth living.
They began to experiment on people, and they violated the Hippocratic Oath. They violated any kind of norm in medical science. It's not surprising that that's what people associate with Nazi Germany.
But the story of German technology during the Nazi era was more complicated than the common perception of evil scientists carrying out heinous experiments and nothing more.
Well, we tend to regard science in the Nazi period purely in terms of black and white, as cruel experiments done by Mengele or other people on these concentration camp prisoners. when in fact you have a massive scientific state that's developed, that is pioneering medical techniques, that is pioneering rocketry and optical techniques in industry, chemistry, all aspects of science. So the period is much more complex and more rich and more interesting historically than the simple story of abuse of science in the concentration camps.
Hitler's fascist regime had come to power in Germany in 1933. The shocking reality is that it happened in one of the most scientifically advanced countries in the world. At the time, Germany could boast half of the world's Nobel Prize winners. After 1933, most Jewish scientists were removed from their posts. Of the rest of the scientific body, many willingly became members of the Nazi Party. Many of the Aryan scientists who refused to join the party nevertheless continued their research and were responsible for some of the most important inventions of the 20th century. But much of this research had its roots in the democratic Germany of the Weimar Republic, before Hitler came to power.
There were a lot of technological discoveries in many different areas, from quantum physics to biology. So there was a real flowering of science during the Weimar period.
One of these inventions revolutionized all scientific research. Work on the electron microscope had begun in the 1920s and came to fruition in 1931. Scientific experiment was changed forever.
You cannot think of modern science without computers. You can also not think of modern science without the electron microscope, or certainly all the knowledge that has been collected with the electron microscope.
The genius behind the discovery was Ernst Ruska, a young German electrical engineer who was based at the Berlin Technical College. His secretary, Lotte Lambert, worked closely with him right to the end.
Everybody liked to work with him and for him. He was very popular. He was regarded, everybody said he's the father of the electron microscope. His work was his life. He was what we would call today a workaholic.
The dreadful irony was that as Nazi Germany was becoming the most murderous regime in modern history, Ruska had developed a marvelous machine that would uncover the secrets of life itself. The microscope had changed little in the years since it was discovered, but in the 20th century it was no longer adequate. The power of an optical microscope is limited by the wavelengths of the light beams used to view a specimen. Since electrons have shorter wavelengths, they can magnify more. Ruska's genius was the discovery that a magnetic coil could act as a lens to focus an electron beam.
Here on this PowerPoint presentation is a picture of the design of the first microscope that had more than one lens. And this design has as date 9th of March 1931. And here you see these areas that are crossed through here and here. Those are actual magnetic lenses. And his main invention, or one of the principal inventions, was to concentrate the magnetic field into a very narrow gap. And in that very narrow gap, one then has a very strong magnetic field, and thus very strong lenses. And that is what made the high magnifications possible that he first achieved.
This is what Ruska's electron microscope has become today, a revolutionary and complex piece of engineering that can investigate the fundamental building blocks of life itself.
The electron microscope was called das Übermikroskop, and the super microscope, and it was a quantum jump. Suddenly you can look inside cells. You can see mitochondria, you can see all kinds of little compartments in cells, and the whole organization of life within the cell was largely explored by the advent of the electron microscope.
The Nazis, however, took no interest in Ruska's extraordinary discovery. There was, after all, no clear way in which the electron microscope could be directly used to promote Nazi militarism or propaganda or its racial policies. It was left to Ruska and his mentor, Max Noll, to look elsewhere for funding and support. They could see the commercial potential of their invention. But in Germany under Hitler, they struggled to find an entrepreneur willing to finance their work.
They trudged from pillar to post. They gave lectures. They tried to convince people in industry and in big firms who would take the risk to do that. It was difficult to convince them. They didn't believe that it would be useful.
Rüsker, a liberal, bravely stayed inside Nazi Germany and waited 6 years before the industrial giant Siemens finally decided to fund his research.
He worked in industry, which is often seen as inner emigration. You weren't working at the university, teaching students, maybe having to inject ideology into your lectures. So the question is, would it have been better if he emigrated? And would science have been weakened even more if all these fine scientists had left?
Despite the difficulties, Rüsker stayed on in order to pursue his work on the electron microscope. Numerous Nobel Prize winners would owe their own discoveries to Rüsker's invention. But it was not until 1986, just 2 years before his death, that Rüsker himself was awarded the ultimate prize.
This was the crown of his life, the Nobel Prize. He said it was a recognition for electron microscopy. He didn't think of him personally. He said, finally they recognized the whole field of electron microscopy, how important it was. He was happy for that.
The electron microscope may have flourished despite rather than because of the Nazis. Yet in the new possibilities it opened up for research into viruses and other diseases, it paralleled one important aspect of Nazi ideology.
They would call Adolf Hitler the great doctor of the German people. They talked about enemies of the state being like a cancer, or the Jews being like a cancer. They talked about bacillus enemy people. And so you both, I think, at the metaphorical level, the policy level, but also at this level of just increasing the health of the German citizen in order to increase the health of the German state. Medicine and public health was wrapped all of that together.
This was all part of Hitler's propaganda war. But as the 1930s gave way to the 1940s, Hitler had to concentrate on the very real war he was fighting against the Allies. Hitler urgently needed to acquire new military hardware. To achieve that, German technological expertise would play a vital role.
On September the 1st, 1939, the Nazi army smashed into Poland.
The outbreak of war in 1939 radically changed the focus of German science and technology. The overriding priority became the development of new weapons that could give Hitler the military advantage.
Wars tend to have a tremendous forcing function on technology. They tend to accelerate technology simply because a nation state has no higher obligation than to survive in war.
What the war does is it shifts priorities in the direction of pragmatism, the pragmatism of short-term military goals.
Almost everybody that wanted to try to do something was able to get money from the German government. If it was, let's say, guised in the context of a wonder weapon or a super breakthrough technology or something that could turn the tide of the war.
Famously, the V-1 and V-2 flying bombs eventually became the super weapons that Hitler believed could win him the war. In the early 1940s, both the Allies and Germany desperately sought air superiority, and the key to this was ever faster planes. Both sides were striving to develop a fighter plane powered by a jet engine. German engineers got there first. The man behind the new aircraft was Ernst Haenkel.
Ernst Haenkel was an individual who was really obsessed with speed. It seems to have been the great unifying driver in his technical life.
Piston-driven planes were already flying in excess of 450 miles per hour, virtually at the limit of propeller-powered flight. But Haenkel was determined to go one better and become the first man to build a jet engine.
And he put together a team under what he called Special Project 2, which was kind of highly proprietary, and we would call it a compartmented program. They built a special